Okay, why don't we get started? Hide meeting controls, and let me make sure I um uh, desktop. Okay. Yep. All right. It's doing what I understand it's doing. All right. So good morning. Happy Monday. I hope you all had a great weekend. Today, as I had mentioned on Friday, we're gonna run today as a workshop of sorts, and I'm gonna do live coding today, although I reserve the right to refer to my notes here. And this is purposed with getting you practice with using some of the machine learning APIs supporting the methods we've talked about thus far. And again, you could easily have more than a semester actually in just the machine learning part. And so I've included Project 6 workshop, Jupyter Notebook, on the course Canvas site for the project number 6 assignment. And this is the last project of the semester. And we will also, after this, have our final project, which is what remains. And so with this notebook, I purposefully didn't include the solution because I really want people to get a sense of just what the implementations afford you. And I'll be switching back and forth between the Python documentation. And for your convenience, I've included some links to that in the comments in the notebook for the workshop, as well as I will be switching back and forth today, as I don't expect you to memorize all of the details of these APIs, and I certainly don't memorize that myself. Okay. Any questions before we jump right in? Okay. And so if you have your computational device, I know some of you, I'll see some of you have them out, so please feel free. And I'd like to make this as interactive as I can. I know on a Monday morning at 9 o'clock, that's not always, desirable, but we'll give this a try and see how it works out. Okay, so we start out in the notebook, and we're including all the modules that we're going to be using. And of course, NumPy is always good for your Python code. It's very useful. And we're going to actually make use of NumPy. We have Matplotlib because we're going to be doing some visualizations. Pandas, because at this juncture, you should be using data frames. While using NumPy arrays is not incorrect, data frames afford you a lot of great features that frees you from your consideration algorithmically for implementing yourself these constructs like concatenation and things like that if you were doing it yourself in NumPy. So while, I appreciate people's algorithmic thinking, don't burn your time on stuff that can easily be done with a single API call in NumPy, right? Make use of the tools that you have. And so I'm also going to be showing you an example of max likelihood estimation, MLE, that we talked about. And so we've imported from SciPy Stats the module for the normal distribution. And SciPy Stats has all the distributions that we've talked about and then some. We only talked about a handful that are very popular, but there are many other, both discrete and continuous distributions that we have not talked about. We'll also, scikit-learn, we import k-means. That's an implementation of Lloyd's algorithm, k-means clustering. And with all of these APIs, especially some of the machine learning APIs, as well as some of the metrics APIs, you have lots and lots of options you can specify. And we can't possibly go over all of the options in a 15-week semester. Any questions? No? All right. And so we have a few things from the metrics that are going to be important for our use. Again, this is a nod to your using what's in the API instead of burning your time implementing these things. You could absolutely implement them if you have a burning desire to do it yourself, wonderful, but you're best served saving that for after the course is over, right? I don't want you to burn your time on this sort of thing so that you can focus on what the particular task is at hand for the assignment. And so we have the accuracy score, and that's going to be useful for perceptron learning algorithm, or PLA, that we talked about, that linear model in feature space. And that's going to be used to determine how well our model did. And we'll talk about how you do that in just a moment, so-called out-of-sample error, which we only barely mentioned when we talked about the anatomy of a learner. We also have for metrics the Davies-Bolden score, which we talked about as our quality measure for clusters, and that answered the question of what is the best k-value number of groupings for your data set. And we said that Davies-Bolden score was the proportion between the in-cluster sum squared difference between each point in the grouping and the center, and the dispersion or separation between different cluster centers. Okay, to jar your memories. Any question? No? Now, this last one from scikit-learn metrics is mean squared error. And mean squared error is how you measure the quality of a regression model. Recall, a regression model is just like the supervised learning problem, but instead of having a discrete class label, +1, -1, approved, denied, like we talked about with the mortgage application problem or the credit approval problem, for regressions, our labels are real value. And so if you have some model that you have fit on data or to data, this best fit line that we talked about for regression, and we use tools from linear algebra to do that, if you're going to judge how well it performs relative to ground truth for new data, you need to measure the squared difference, the average or the mean squared difference between that ground truth label and the output, y hat, from your regression model, your predictor. Does that make sense? Any questions? And so I really highly encourage you, especially for things like the metrics, to just use the APIs that are there for you. It's a common thing to implement these sort of measures for your models. So just use the API. And if you have time afterwards, then go ahead and implement it yourself, right? But don't burn your time on these sorts of implementation considerations. And so from scikit-learn, I've also imported tree. We're not going to use that just yet. That's for decision trees. We'll talk about decision trees after we talk about entropy on Friday's class meeting. And it's another type of classifier supervised learning approach. And this particular approach is interesting in that it gives you a so-called interpretable model. And so you might be asking, what is an interpretable model? Okay, well, when we consider something like a regression model or PLA, when we train the final model, we have basically a weight vector. That was weird. Did that come from outside? Okay, all right. Random thuds just kind of, all right. PLA, yes. So when our PLA algorithm has halted or finished finding this final best hypothesis, we're left with a weight vector. And for 2 dimensions, you could think of this weight vector as the parameters of a line on the plane, the slope m, and the y-intercept b. So if you were trying to read off for a mortgage application, well, why did I not get a mortgage? Well, the weight vector for our model was 0.7, 0.02, and sine W transpose X was -1 for you. What in the world does that mean, right? And so there are a class of models, decision trees is one, learning models, where when the model finishes, not only does it predict what some output should be, some labeling, you can also very easily read off how it arrived upon its decision. And that's a decision tree is one of the models that does that. And we'll talk about that on Friday. And so we also have something called model selection. And this model selection set of APIs implements what's called a train test split, part of what's called cross-validation, which we haven't talked about. And we use this to simulate this idea of out-of-sample data, of new data. Because you don't really have new data, all you're given is your existing in-sample data. So how do you test the efficacy of your model if you don't know ground truth, what the labels are for new data, because by definition, the unknown target function is out there assigning labels, but you don't get those labels unless it's from historical data. So what do? We'll talk about that as well. We'll also look at linear regression. So we've imported a linear model, and there are several nonlinear models, but we're using linear regression. And then we'll also use the perceptron. Any questions? That makes sense? Okay. So fairly mundane, okay. We will import our libraries, and then we're going to set up our path name. And I've already established to put my CSV file, which is also on the Canvas site, to put it here in this directory from which I've run my Jupyter Notebook, right? So that's a good practice to do, whether you're on Windows or some Unix variant, be that Mac OS or Ubuntu Linux, to just put your data file right there next to your Jupyter Notebook. So when your tired professor goes and downloads your zip file and uncompresses it, don't have to change much because it's right there and I can just run your notebook. That would be greatly appreciated. And so we're going to load the data file. So let me ask you, how are we going to load the data file? What are we going to do? Yep. Read CSV. Okay. So let's call it the the data. I like shorter names. Data frame equals PD read CSV. And we're going to give it the path name. We're going to say file path plus, and since I'm on Unix, I use the / for the path separator. And then we're going to give it the file name. Now, I've included two versions of this data file. One is the regular data file, historical customer data, and another one, hopefully I put it on the Canvas site, historical data bad, right? And historical data bad has some missing entries in the data. Okay. And so for part of Project 6, you're asked to correct it and test that out, your correction mechanisms or implementation using the bad data. Okay. I just didn't want to do it here. Right. Any questions? No? All right. So of course, anytime you read in data, it's really important to take a look at it on data frame. And then it tells you a bunch of things, such as the index, the default index, we know is very important, especially if you have time series data, right? Because it's not always the case that the index, when you load it, is going to be the default index. And so if you had time series data that you found with the exponential weighted moving average, the leading indicator project, that sometimes when you load or you read your data from CSV or whatever format, you have to tell the API to replace the default index with some other columns worth of data, right? And so one consideration is, okay, is my data trafficking in time series constructs, things that proceed in time, like stock ticker prices? Any questions? No? All right. And so we look at the data, and certainly one of the things we could do is we could look at the shape of the data. So let's say data frame shape, if that's the one off the top of my head. And if we do that, we know that it's 200 rows and it's 3 columns. And the implementation of a data frame is you have a set of rows and columns, and each column is a series. And you can slice this using array index notation, using the name of the column. Now, of course, when you're dealing with CSV, CSV doesn't have dictionaries. It has a so-called column header row, which is typically the first row in a CSV file. So if you found that when you loaded your data and you looked at the value, if something was off, if it didn't have a header row in the CSV file, it's going to interpret that first row as the header, and you're going to get these weird numbers as your names or the key values associated with the data frame. So before you even begin, it's really important to look at the raw data. Certainly, it's hard to do with Parquet. Parquet is a well-defined binary format. You wouldn't need to do that with Parquet. But for CSV, you want to go in to the raw CSV file in a text editor and take a look at what you have. Okay, any questions? No? So we take a look at the data. Okay, everything looks good. And now we want to isolate, in this case, the so-called positive examples from the negative examples. And the reason for doing that is because we're enterprising first to visualize it as a so-called supervised learning problem. And it's typically the tradition using data sets in machine learning, particularly CSV files. It's typical that the last column is your so-called target value, or which is a synonym for the ground truth label from that unknown target function. Does that make sense? Okay. So if we want to visualize the data, okay, that means we want to segregate our data or stratify our data into two subsets. One's going to be those who are approved, which have a target of +1, and the others are going to be those who are denied, which have a target of -1. So how might we do that? We want to pull these two groups apart. No? Not at 9 o'clock in the morning? Yeah? Grab all the records, those that are positive examples and those that are negative examples. Filtering, okay. And so let's do that filtering. And because I created the data set, I have all of the positive examples for the first 100 rows of the data frame and all the negative examples for the second 100 rows of the data frame, but that's never going to happen in real life, right? They're going to be interleaved somehow. And so filtering is the approach you would want to use. Of course, we're using the facilities in the data frame. So let's do that. Data frame DF, data DF, positive examples. And we have data, we're going to call it DF, negative examples. Okay, so when we're filtering, okay, we say data, data DF, and we're going to have our parenthesized expression. And then this is going to end up pulling out records out of the data frame. And we're going to give it our condition, data DF. And we want to compare that last column, which is called target with a capital T. And it's really important to use the precise, the exact capitalization because capitalization matters for key values for a data frame. Okay, so we're going to take those for which the target is equal to +1, and then we're also going to take from the data frame those examples whose target value is equal to -1. And I don't multitask, so I can't talk and type at the same time. Although I can play the bass guitar and talk, but I can't do programming. Anyways, so I do that. And it's useful to want to, equals. Here we go. All right, so we'll do that. And then we'll just take a look at these particular frames, data DF positive, and we'll put next to it data DF negative. Okay, so we do that. Okay, we see that all the target values for the first group, positive examples, have +1 target, and negative examples have -1 target. Okay, and so now we might want to visualize this as a supervised learning problem. So let's go ahead and we're going to produce a plot. And for this plot, we're going to register it as a scatter plot. And we're going to color the points for the positive examples differently from the negative examples. And this time we're going to do the positive examples let's do it as blue and the negative examples as red. And so it's really important to do your visualization, keeping in mind that when you produce these plots, you can only visualize them 2 or 3 features at a time. And so it's up to you if you're giving a presentation and it's based on some multi-dimensional data set, more than 3 dimensions, you have to decide which particular feature pairs are most important to visualize for your scatter plot. Does that make sense? And when we talk about entropy, information theoretic methods on Friday, that gives you a tool that you can use in a nonlinear fashion to measure the coupling between variables. Up to this point, we've only been talking about correlation. Correlation is only for linear relationships. But if your data have nonlinear relationships, correlation is not going to give you a very good representation of what we've been calling the coupling between variables. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. So we can do that. Okay. So let's do our plot, and let's just do a scatter plot. I'm going to go to my cheat sheet here. Figure, PLT, figure. And if we wanted to resize it, we could do that with a figure environment, scatter plot. And we're going to plot the positive examples. So let's just go ahead and give it the slice for the data DF positive, data DF positive. And we're going to plot along the x-axis the annual salary. Hopefully I have my capitalization right, annual salary, years in residence. And then we're going to plot for our y-axis data DF positive, years in residence. Okay, hopefully I spelled that correctly. And so now we're going to plot that using, let me remind myself, Python scatter plot color and symbol. We go to the documentation for scatter plot, and let's look for an example. C equals colors. I don't want to do that. Let me look at oh, where was it? I can't remember. Let me look at my cheat sheet, and it cut off. Let me do this. I know I'm cheating. Okay, let me just do that. All right. So we're gonna do our scatter plot. Just that to remind myself. C equals blue marker. I forgot what's C and marker. Marker equals, let's just make it I don't know, little O, just to be a little bit different. Okay. So then let's do the same thing for the negative examples. Scatter data DF negative, annual salary versus years in residence. Years in residence. Color, let's say red, and marker equals O. Okay, so we have the same marker for both the positive and negative examples. Let me save that. And now we have our data colored by the class label. Now, of course, if you had a lot of more than 2 categories, let's say you had 10 categories, there's a way to iterate programmatically through a color palette. And if you Google search color palettes, it'll show you an array of mixtures of different colors, and you can just index into that array and select the color programmatically, not necessarily entering in C option for color. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'll leave that programmatic approach to you to look up in the API documentation for color palettes. Okay, so now we're going to convert this to the clustering problem. And we said the clustering problem is unsupervised learning. And in unsupervised learning, you don't have ground truth target labels from our unknown target function. And so I wanted to give it to you as a CSV file, but you can achieve the equivalent by just stripping away that third column, that target column, and just pretend that's how you got your data. Does that make sense? All right. So this is just really just to acknowledge that we're doing this programmatically because I don't want to have to specify 2 different CSV files. Okay. So we're going to convert this to a clustering problem, and we're going to visualize it. And so what we're going to do, we're going to say, data DF clustering, data DF clustering version is equal to data DF, and we're going to slice out just the features, um, years in residence and annual salary. Okay, and so when you do the slice on the data frame, if you give it this array of key values, it'll pull out those particular series or columns from the original data frame and return them back to you. Does that make sense? So if we do that, let me save. Let me add another cell here. And we're going to add that cell. And now we're going to isolate the positive examples from the negative examples. Actually, I did that in a bad way because you don't really know what the positive and negative examples are. So did it the wrong way. We're just going to plot as a scatter plot all of our data, right? Because it's an unsupervised learning problem, all we can do is visualize the points in feature space, thus looking at all of their feature values. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a plot, PLT, scatter, and we're going to plot X versus Y, annual salary versus years in residence. So we're going to say data DF, the clustering version. We're going to plot annual salary versus years in residence, data DF clustering version, years in residence. Residence. How do I spell that? Yeah, okay. So let's do that. Enter. And so these graphs, they're a little bit unlabeled. So let's give it a title. Let's say, call this the mortgage approval problem. And let's X label. That was annual salary. And that's in thousands. Oops, thousands. And Y label, years in residence. We don't need to say years. It's sort of obvious from the name. So let me save that. And then likewise, let's label the unsupervised version. So let's just say mortgage customers, right? Customers, and the labels are the same for the axes. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. So let me go ahead, save that. Let's see our labeled graph. Okay, scatter plot. And this is our mortgage customers. Okay. So now we have an unsupervised learning version. So now we're going to identify the groupings in our data. Now, of course, you can visually see ground truth from the supervised learning version of the problem. You have two groupings. The red grouping, we've been calling those who are denied, those associated from the original classification problem, those who are denied for mortgage, and the blue points were those individuals by their features who are approved for mortgage. In the unsupervised learning version, we just have the feature values. We don't know the labels. So now we're going to determine what those labels are by performing k-means clustering. But before we can perform k-means clustering, we want to know how many clusters we should have. So we're going to explore a little bit, and we're going to say the min number of clusters. Let's assume it was 2. And theoretically, you could have 1 cluster. It's sort of trivially true. But the API won't allow you to run k-means with a cluster of 1, right? And we're going to set our max clusters. How many is a good max clusters? What do you think? Someone pick a number. 10. There we go. Thank you. 10 clusters. And now we're going to run our Davies-Bolden analysis in order to do that. And so when we do clustering, of course, it's an unsupervised learning problem. And let's go look at our k-means API to remind ourselves about how it works, okay? Now, in the scikit-learn, it seems like everyone made the engineering meeting, and the APIs are very consistent in that when you want to run the learning algorithm, that's through calling the fit API. You're fitting your data to your learning model. And so that's fairly consistent in all of our scikit-learn machine learning implementations. So let's go ahead and let me pop over to Firefox here, and we'll bring up k-means. And for k-means, and this is generally the case in scikit-learn, it'll give you the name, signature of the API, and all of the API options. And of course, when you see one that has something assigned like n clusters equals 8, that's the default value, right? So if you don't specify that option when you call the API, when you instantiate, in this case, the k-means object, it's going to set that value for you, right? So if you wanted to set some number of clusters that you define instead of accepting the default, you're going to have to specify that first parameter, which is the number of clusters. Does that make sense? All right. So here we call k-means, and you'll notice here there's an option called max iterations. The default is 300. And so when we run this Lloyd's algorithm, we talked about this alternation between the expectation step and the maximization step. And we said that it alternates until one of two things happens. Either you reach a maximum number of alternations between expectation and maximization, or you reach some maximum, or the assignments don't change. And so that's so that this algorithm halts, because it's exponential in the number of examples. This thing could run for a very long time if you said keep running until you find the best clustering. Okay, and so max iterations is defaulted to 300 iterations, but if for whatever reason you wanted to override the number of times it goes to that alternation between expectation step and maximization step, you can absolutely change that default. Okay, and then random state. This random state corresponds to, let me remind myself, the random number generator. And when you generate a random number, you get multiple calls. So you do it through multiple calls to the random number generator. Get me a random integer, get me a random floating point number. You get a so-called random number sequence. Now, sometimes you want it to be random all the time, but other times, for the purpose of reproducing an experimental result, you want to use the same random number sequence, right? Because one of the questions experimentally that you want to be able to answer was the difference in the effect on some measurement or some method you used, was that difference due to randomization? And so by using the same random number seed, you're telling the random number generation algorithm, the modern one is something called Mersenne Twister, to generate the same sequence. So if you wrote a Python program and you set a random number seed to the same number, each time you run that random number generator, you're going to get the same sequence of randomly selected values. Does that make sense? And so randomization is good and it's important, but from an experimental perspective, you want to save your random number seed so that randomization isn't the reason why you have differences in effect. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's go back, excuse me, excuse me, go back to our clustering, and we're going to set a dictionary, and we're going to use the dictionary to hold the K values as our keys, and we're going to have the DBI score as the values. And I'm doing that because when you plot the graph, it's a lot easier to let it use the keys for the labelings on the horizontal axis. And so we have, we'll call it results. It's an empty dictionary. And we're going to say for I, range, min, clusters, max clusters. Okay. And I think natively in Java, k-means, k-means, and we're going to say n clusters is I. Okay, so we're going to set it to min clusters, which is 2, then 3, then 4. And remember, range does not include the endpoint. So it's an open interval. So if we wanted to try 10 clusters, max clusters would be 11. Okay. Any questions? No? All right. So we're going to call k-means with num clusters as I, and we're going to accept the default 300 iterations of our expectation step and maximization step. And then we're going to call fit, and we're going to give it the data set. Now, when we go back to k-means, one of the things to pay attention to for any of the APIs, when we call fit, it'll tell you what it's expecting, all right? So compute the k-means clustering, okay. Now here, our parameter X, that's going to be our data set. It's going to be a design matrix, the same way we talked about design matrix for regression. And in this matrix, each row is going to be one vector instantiation corresponding to our data set. And so here, you'll notice it says array-like, okay? It didn't say data frame, it says array-like. So we're going to have to convert our data set for which we do clustering. We're going to have to convert it to a NumPy array, okay? And so that's another thing to watch out for, is for all of these methods, and they're not always consistent. What are they expecting as the payload, as the parameter, when you specify data to it? Okay, any questions? No? All right. So let's go ahead. That means we need a version of our data set that's a NumPy array, and we called it data df cluster. And conveniently enough, there is a to NumPy API call on the data frame. So if we say X, our design matrix, is equal to df data df, I think I called it clust, df clust, oops, to NumPy, it'll go ahead and take our two-dimensional table, n by 2, and turn it into a two-dimensional NumPy array. Okay. Any questions? No? All right. So let me speed this up a little bit, so make sure we get past the point for regression. So we'll go ahead and we're going to fit X. X is our data set. And we're going to do that in our loop for I goes from 2 clusters to 10 clusters. Recalling that range doesn't include the endpoint for the upper end of the range. And then we're going to go ahead and compute the Davies-Bolden index. DB index is going to be Davies-Bolden, I always misspell this, Bolden score. And we're going to do that for X. K means labels underscore. Now, when you train a k-means classifier, many of these objects have, sometimes they're called properties. I call them instance variables because I'm a Java person by heart. And these instance variables will be set, in this case for k-means, labels underscore. That's the naming scheme they use. They use an underscore after the name. Labels underscore will be the array of labels corresponding to each one of the rows of our design matrix, position by position. So position 0 in the labels array will be the cluster label for row 0 in our NumPy array. Position 1 in labels will be the cluster label for row 1 in our design matrix X. Does that make sense? Any questions? No? All right. So we compute this Davies-Bolden index, and then I'm going to say results update. So I'm going to add to this dictionary. I'm going to have a dictionary of an array of dictionary entries. Update, and I'm going to add to it a new dictionary entry where the key value is going to be the I, the K value that I'm iterating over, and DB index. I don't know why I call it DB index and not DB score, but the DB score is going to be the value. And so now when I do that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to plot out what this DBI score looks like. PLT plot, I'm going to say, close the paren first, list, turn it into a list, results dot keys. And you have to turn it into a list, otherwise it won't, it's key values, not list elements. And then I'm also going to give it versus turn into a list, results results values. So I'm taking the array of keys, which are the I values, the K values, and I'm taking the array of values, which are the DBI scores, so each dictionary entry, and I'm just plotting that in a graph, in a line plot. Okay, so let me give an X label, and that's number of clusters, num clusters, and let me give it a Y value or a vertical value, Y label, and that's the DBI score. Davies, Bolden. Is it Bolden or Bolding? Bolden. Bolden index or the DBI score. Okay, so let's go ahead. We'll save this and we'll go ahead. Oops, let's see. K-means, I think I misspelled that. Clusters. Oh, K-means, capital M. There we go. Let's see. So this is our DBI score, right? Now we didn't have to do it for 10. It's a good amount to have 10 clusters. If we did it a larger number of clusters, you'd find that it's going to take a lot longer because it has to run k-means each of those times for different k values. So if we did it for 30 clusters, it would take a lot longer. But you see the general trend right around 2, we get the best DBI score. Now, for this particular data set, what you'll find is if you carry out the clusters really, really long, eventually it starts to approach the optimal, but it's the trivial case where you have a very small number of individuals in each of the resulting clusters. I think somewhere around 100, bless you, somewhere around 100, bless you, somewhere around 100. Does that make sense? So it's up to you to decide what makes sense in terms of the number of clusterings. 100 clusterings is a lot for only 200 data points because 100 clusterings means 2 points per cluster, right? If you had several hundreds of millions of customers, maybe 50 to 100 clusters might be reasonable. So even though the DBI score informs what K value is best, you have to still exercise judgment in what values to choose. Does that make sense? All right, so let's set this back to 11 so that we only look for 2 through 10 clusters. And we see that a clustering of 2 minimizes the DBI score. So we're going to go with 2 clusters. Does that make sense? Okay. So now when we get that, if we took a look at our labels, let's look at k-means, labels, underscore, and just how to convince ourselves that it contains the clusters. Oh, you know what? I had to redo it. All right, let me see. The reason why it's set now to 10 clusters, you notice the labels are 0 to 9, is because when I go through my last iteration of the loop, the last one it did was k equals 10, right? So this variable k-means is still in scope, it's still set. So I'm going to go ahead, now that I know it's 2, I'm going to go ahead and rerun my k-means, Lloyd's algorithm, clusters of 2 groupings, now that I know that's the best grouping. Okay, does that make sense? And the only reason why I redid it is because the last one it tried was 10 clusters. So it kept that version of Lloyd's algorithm around when I printed it out. And so if we look at the label array, well, we have a total of 100 positions, 0 through 99, and each position either has a 0 or a 1. And so position by position, if that's position 0, position 1, position 2, that is the cluster for the 0th row, the first row, the second row of our design matrix X. Does that make sense? All right. So now that we know we have some groupings, we're going to now stratify or so-called segregate our cluster. And we could certainly visualize it. And when we visualize it, we'd take each grouping and then we'd plot those points, coloring them for each grouping. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to say group 1 is equal to, and we're going to say data. I think it was the clustering version of the data. What did I call it? Data DF clust. Okay. So we're going to say data df plus. That was the two-dimensional data set in feature space. And we're going to select from that all of those rows based on whether or not the cluster assignment was group 0 or group 1. And so we're going to say k-means labels underscore is equal to 0. Group 2 data df plus k-means labels is equal to group 1. Now, the reason why this works, we'll just sort of, we'll do it this way. If we said k-means labels equals 0, and we ran that, save, we'll see, oh, come on. Oh, labels underscore. Okay. That's the funny part about computers. They do exactly what you asked them to. All right. You'll notice everywhere the condition is matched, we get in this Boolean array, Boolean array, we get a true for those positions where the condition is true, and a false in those positions where it's false. And so if we use that condition comparing labels to one of the label values, it's going to select out that particular row of the resulting data frame. Does that make sense? All right. So we're going to construct two data frames. One is group 1 and one is group 2, where group 1 contains all of the data for those that are in cluster group 0, and group 2 is all of the two-dimensional data for cluster group 1. Okay. Any questions? No? All right. Why's my stopwatch on? Okay. So let's see. Let's go ahead and plot this. And it's going to look a lot like the other stuff we've plotted, but just remember that in a real unsupervised learning problem, you wouldn't have the ground truth labels, right? It's just going to look like it because I wanted to show you that clustering really does do what it's supposed to do. All right, so here we're going to plot scatter, and we're going to plot salary versus years in residence for group 1. So group 1, oh, actually, you know what? Yeah, it's a data frame. Annual salary versus group 1, excuse me, years in residence. And we're going to plot that color equals, I don't know, group 1, red, and marker, red, marker equals equals O. All right. Did I do that right? Marker, something else is wrong. Marker equals, yeah, that's right. No, why is that? Oh, forgot the closing. There we go. All right. So let's do the same thing for group 2. And let's just change that. Group 2. All right. So let's give it title labels, PLT X label. And let's say annual salary and PLT Y label, years in residence. I won't do the thousands. All right, so let me save that. So this is based purely on the cluster label. We segmented the data or stratified the data based on the groupings using that filtering. And then we, why is this parentheses k-means labels? And then we colored them and plot the scatter plot. Oh, it's red. Let's say group 2, blue. Okay, let me save that. So there we go. Group 2 is blue. Let's just swap them. Blue and red. There we go. Just to show you that it is doing what we say it does. Okay. Now, of course, if we were to compare this to the supervised learning, it might be off here and there in some parts of the data, but it does a pretty good job relative to having known what the ground truth labels are. Does that make sense? Any questions? No? All right. So now we're going to make use of these groupings, and we're going to do parameter estimation. And this is using max likelihood estimation. You could use method of moments. There's nothing wrong with that. And this is just to show you what you can do with these methods that we've talked about, the inference part of the semester. And so I know ahead of time that when you call max likelihood estimation here, let's bring up the API for the normal distribution. And if we do that, here's SciPy stats norm. And when we look at the functions in the API, there's a function called fit. And so when you call fit, of course, it's very consistent, SciPy, as well as scikit-learn. It's going to do the parameter estimation. You're so-called fitting the data to this particular IID normal model assumption. And so here it says, go ahead and look at SciPy stats RV continuous fit for the detailed documentation. And it says here, the data, that's going to be your data set that you're fitting, it has to be array-like, okay? So that says you can't use the data frame, you have to use the NumPy array or Python array. But since NumPy is a little bit easier to work with, we're going to make use of NumPy. So that means we need to know the years in residence and annual salary for both of the groups. So we're going to say X1 is our first group, group 1 to NumPy, the NumPy version. X2 is our second group, the NumPy version, as a design matrix, group 2 to NumPy. Okay, so now that we've done that, we want to pull out the annual salary and years in residence. And so in the data frame, when we look back at the data frame, it was organized so that years in residence came first, right? As a column. So that means if we have a two-dimensional array, that 0th column is going to be years in residence in the NumPy version, and that 1th column offset is going to be annual salary. Does that make sense? All right. So now let me go ahead and I'm going to pull out X1 years in residence and X1 annual salary. And years in residence is going to be X1. We're going to take every row, the 0th column, okay? And we're going to take X1 every row, the 1th column, okay? And we're going to do that for the first group as well as for the second group, okay? So we're going to call that X2, and we're going to pull that out of the NumPy array for the second group. All right, does that make sense? All right. And so after we've done that, now we're going to do max likelihood estimation. So we're going to fit estimator, MLE for group 1, and then we're going to do MLE for group 2. MLE for group 2, okay? So now we're going to say, okay, when we do max likelihood estimation, we're going to call norm fit, and we're going to give it X1 years in residence. And we're going to say the method is max likelihood estimation. If we wanted method of moments estimation, we'd say MME, okay? And this is going to return two things. It's going to return in the documentation, they say the location and the scale parameter. The location parameter is the first moment, non-centered, that's the mean. And the scale parameter is the second centralized moment, which is the variance. Okay. So we're going to return it. It's going to be a multiple return. So we're going to say mu hat MLE years from the first group. And the second moment is going to be sigma squared hat MLE from years 1. Okay. Oops. I keep saying YERS. I don't know why I do that. And so we're going to do that for both of the features. we're going to do that for years and annual salary. Okay. And so we're going to say X1, annual sal, and we're going to call that, instead of years, we're going to call that salary, sal1, and we're going to call this sal1. Okay, hopefully I did that right. Okay, so if we do that for the first group, we can also certainly do that for the second group. So let's do that for our second group. All right, so we do that. So it's years two, and this is going to be X2. That's going to be X2. That's going to be salary 2, and that's going to be salary 2. Now, of course, we're treating these variables as if they were independent. That's a false assumption, but for this class, that's fine because we haven't talked about multivariate versions of the distributions, and we're not talking about something called covariance. We did lightly, but the covariance matrix for the normal multivariate normal distribution. And so we do this, and now we're just going to go ahead and we're going to print out what these estimators are. Okay, so let me go ahead in the interest of time, because we only have 20 minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to copy the solution for the printing out from that for my MLE. And group 1, norm fit. So let me do that printout. Just a formatted print so you can actually see it. So that's group 1. I'm going to print that out. And group 2, we're going to print that out. And if we compare that to the actual graph, you can actually see, yeah, it's doing this estimation. All right, so let me see. Let me do that. Let me see. The print out, years 2, salary 2. Okay, let's try that out. So we do that. We go ahead and we see that for the first group, years average is 15. And for the salary, average is 24. Okay, so if we look at our first group, which was 24, okay, 24 right about here. And then we have about 15, which is the center. Yeah, so it gets it right. Our max likelihood estimate builds a normal distribution for each one of the features for group 1 and group 2. So what can you do with that? Well, that's part of the workshop exercise. Now, you know a good description for these feature values for each of the groupings, and you've arrived upon them using max likelihood estimation from the data points for each group that you found through clustering. Now you can create fake customers, right? If you take these max likelihood estimates for each group, you can now sample years in residence and the annual salary for group 1, and it'll give you a new point, and you just construct it, and you can pretend that's one of your data points, and actually draw those new sampled customers among your existing customers from your historical data. Does that make sense? Any questions? Now, of course, I haven't shown you here, but what you can do with that is either try to predict a missing attribute from some record, or you could use it to augment your data. And so if your data has a small number of examples, one of the things people do is amplify their data, increase the number of data points without damaging the statistics by fitting a distribution like this, and then you upsample, meaning you generate, if you only had 100 from group 1 that you were given, you might sample another 20 and another 100, another 1,000, and so forth. Does that make sense? Any questions? Yes. I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, good. Well, it says array-like, so I'm not sure what version you're using, but I would err on the side of whatever the latest documentation says. But thank you. All right. So yes, so you can use the NumPy array, the pandas directly. All right. Because at home, it doesn't allow me to do that. I'm using not the most current version. I think it's like 2-point versions in the past. All right. Any other questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah. So you would then use the MVS, multivariate sampling routines, just like our sampling project. and you would specify these particular MLE parameters as the mean and the variance of a normal distribution, and then sample from that to generate samples. And those samples you generate would be the annual salary and the years in residence for that fake customer. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So now we've done the MLE, and now here we'll create a classification problem for each grouping. And so for that, I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to copy I'm just going to copy the code, and I'll talk about what it does. So let's see. We're running out of time. All right. So one of the things you can do with clustering is, now that you have these groupings, you can take one group and call them the +1 labels, and you can take another group and call them the -1 labels. So you can use clustering to assign labels to your unlabeled data, and then use something like PLA to do your classification. Does that make sense? All right. It's immensely useful if you don't have labels. And so here we're going to create a data frame, and we called it, I think I call it data DF. I can't remember what I called it. I think it was data.df clust. I think I called data DF clust. Data DF clust. Data DF clust. Okay. And I know I did that up before, but I just want to use the same code. Let me make sure this works. Yeah, that works. Okay. So here we start out and we segregate the data based on the clustering labels. And now we go ahead and we measure the shape. We want to know, in this case, how many examples we have in group 1 cluster and what we're calling group 2 cluster. So after that, we then construct an array of zeros, because we're going to populate that to be +1 or -1 labels. So I create an array, and this certainly isn't the only way to do it. And then I go ahead, since it's an array of all zeros with the right counts for the membership of individuals to each one of the groupings. For the first label, we're going to call that the -1 group, right? And for the second, we're going to call that the +1 group. So I just literally subtract 1 from each position in that NumPy array of zeros, or add 1 to that NumPy array of zeros. And so now I go back to my original data frame, which was the segregated version of those data points in 2 dimensions based on their cluster label. And I go ahead and I create a new column. And so here, data frame assign says, take now this NumPy array and make it a new column in this data frame. And so here I'm adding a new column, and this is not the only way to do it. And one column for group 1 is going to have all -1s, and the other is going to have all +1s. And so I'm creating labels based on the cluster membership. Any questions? No? All right. So now that I've done that, I extract the data portion separate from the target label. Now, this was a constructed target label that I constructed based purely on my group membership. So then I go ahead and I take my positive examples and for the data, and my negative examples, and then I take my positive labels and my negative labels, and I concatenate them into a single data set. And now I go to NumPy and I say, turn this data frame, these data frames, one has the features and one has the labels that I've created based on cluster membership, and turn them into a NumPy array. Now this next portion, train, test, split. Now and I'll go back to PowerPoint for this. When we talked about the anatomy of a learner, we said that among other things, in our anatomy of a learner, we had those portions that you had no control over. We said we have our target function, and that target function takes vector instantiations, X, and it associates them with a label set, Y. Now, this label set, we created them, right? We created them from our clustering. But it still fits in the framework that it came from us, from our analysis. Ultimately, that was from the data. Now, of course, this target function, it assigns labels to each one of these vector instantiations, which are our features. Now, we said in the anatomy of a learner, we have a probability distribution over our vector instantiations that gives us our so-called in-sample data. Now, when we run our learning algorithm, we have our hypothesis set, script H, and we have our learning algorithm. And our learning algorithm takes our data and searches through our hypothesis set for some working hypothesis, final best hypothesis we call G, and we want this G to approximate the labeling action of this function. Now, this is called in-sample data, the data that you have. Here in the wild, this is your out of sample data, okay? Now, of course, if you want to test the efficacy of your classifier, all you have is your data set. So how in the world do you get this out of sample data? That's simulated. And how that's simulated is you take your data set, and your data is your in-sample data. You have your target, right? And that will be your plus ones and your minus ones. And you have your features. That'll be your variables, x1, x2, your random variables. And you have your vector instantiations. Now, what you do, you take your data set and you partition it in some proportion. One you call your training set. And that's going to be what you're going to use to train your model. The other you set aside, and that's called your test set. And when you set aside this test set, here, now you're going to take your training set and you're going to input that into your learning algorithm, which makes use of your hypothesis set. And that's going to output a final best hypothesis, G, right? Now, when you do that, after you get your final best hypothesis, G, you're now going to take your test set, X test, and you're going to run all of those examples through your final best hypothesis. So what you're doing, you're pretending that your model, because it's true, that your model hasn't seen those data points that you've set aside. And the nice thing is, because you know plus one, minus one for that data you set aside, now you can compare what your final best hypothesis does relative to the ground truth label from what you've set aside from that test set. Does that make sense? Any questions? And so it's literally simulating, or more correctly, estimating what the performance would be out of sample. And there's rigorous proofs that with a big enough data set, it converges to very, very close to what the out of sample error would be. Okay, so let me close this. Let me close this PowerPoint. Oh, keep. And let's go back. And I'm going to have to continue this on Wednesday and figure out something about the due date. So here, we take all of our data and we split out the testing portion. So we're setting aside 25% of our all-inclusive data set, and 25% of it we're going to set aside and use for testing. And the remaining 75% we're going to use to train our model. Does that make sense? Okay. So we go ahead and we do that set aside, and train test split is a tool. You give it all of your data features, that's all X. You give it all of the labels for those rows of all X, that's all Y. You give it the test set size and then the random number C, because we want to reproduce this. We don't want the performance to be different because the randomizer got lucky in certain types of ways, selecting advantageous data points to be set aside for testing and training. So now we're going to perform our classification. And for this classification, we're going to use a perceptron. And this perceptron is a little bit wonky. I'll just copy and paste. And we'll do PLA for this. And so in our perceptron function, it takes an array, but the target values for perceptron, it has to be a one-dimensional array, not a column, even though it's n rows by one column. It's still the same thing mathematically, but it wants programmatically a one-dimensional Python array or array-like structure. And so here we instantiate the perceptron, we give it the training data, which is that set aside 75%, and we give it the Y labels for the training data. Ravel just says take it and make it a one-dimensional array. And now we go ahead and we train it. Now, when we train it, we run PLA using the defaults, which is fit. It's consistent in the scikit-learn. The fit function is to run the learning algorithm. And now we say, go ahead and do the predictions on your training set, do the predictions on your set-aside test set. Now, when we do the predictions on your set-aside training set, that's so-called in-sample error. It's the error on all its in-sample points. And when we do the predictions, the estimates on the set-aside test set, that's our out-of-sample error. Does that make sense? And so there's rigorous theories from computational learning theory that says if you strike the right balance with your models, your in-sample error is going to be very close to your out-of-sample error. And you can see 0.9, 90% is in-sample, 0.86 is out-of-sample. Okay? All right. And so this out-of-sample error is what you want to get as good as possible by striking the right balance between different aspects of your anatomy of a learner. And those physics, if you will, between the various components is the subject of a machine learning course that is rigorous theory based. Okay. Any questions? No? All right. So now this last thing is linear regression. And I'll just end here. We have 3 more minutes. And one of the useful things for linear regression in this case is imagine you have your groupings from clustering that you discover. And you know what the optimal K value is from Davis-Bouldin index that you've tried through some range of K values. Now you want to take a grouping and you want to predict what functional relationship is between some of the variables and one of the other variables. And so in this case, I'll just copy the solution. And we'll say, train our linear regression. And we start out here, and I'll post the solution on the Canvas site. We have group 1. I forgot what I called it. Yeah, group 1 data frame. Group 1 data frame. And we call that, we extract the salary and the years in residence. And we're going to treat our salary as the independent variable. And we want to find what function of salary is the year of residence. Now, of course, if we had 3 things, annual salary, years of residence, and outstanding debt, for example, you can choose any of your variables to be the real valued target for the regression model. It doesn't matter which one you choose. So you choose one of your variables as your real valued target for the regression, and then the others are going to be the function of that it's trying to find weights for to try to see what combination of the other variables do you need to make a linear function that is very close to what that target is. And so this Y value here, the real valued target, you can choose whatever variable you want. So you can say years in residence is what function of annual salary, right? You could say if you had 3 features, debt is what function of years in residence and annual salary, for example. Does that make sense? And so regression is a useful tool for determining what these functional relationships are. And it's not just linear functions, but we aren't talking in this class about nonlinear regression. Okay, so we do that and we select for group 1, its annual salary as the independent variable, and we select years in residence for group 1 as the dependent variable. We produce a training and testing split. So we're going to set aside 20% of our group 1 members to be a test set. The remaining 80%, we're going to train our regression model using pseudo-inverse, our least squared projection that we talked about last time. So we instantiate the object, we call fit, and it's kind of nice. Scikit-learn is very nicely done. They are consistent. We give it the training data, and we give it the labels for the training data, and then we go ahead and do the prediction, okay? So now that we do this prediction, Y hat are all of those estimates that output from that linear model, what it thinks the years in residence should be for a given input annual salary. Does that make sense? All right. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to compute mean squared error. The mean squared error is the average squared difference between what our linear model says it should be versus the ground truth. And we can do that because we've set aside our test data. It hasn't seen it yet. So we run mean squared error. It's 14 point blah, blah, blah. And so the goal is then to choose a regression that minimizes the mean squared error. So it's not too bad. The squared difference on average is 14 and change, which isn't bad for our problem. All right, so now let's visualize it. And in this visualization, what we're going to do is we're going to plot our predictor variable, which is salary, annual salary, and then the response variable is going to be our years in residence. So we go ahead and we call scatter plot. We want to plot the points, and then we're going to plot the regression line itself. And so for the horizontal axis, we have the values for annual salary, but for the vertical axis, we're going to have the predictions because we want to plot the line itself, the regression line. Does that make sense? So we go ahead and we do that. And we see here our points are blue on the scatter, and our regression line is here in the red. Now you notice it doesn't span our whole data set. The reason is because remember, this was on the test data. And so here, let's go ahead and redo the plot. But the difference here is we're not just going to evaluate our regression on the test data. We're going to evaluate it on all of the data. So here, when we do predict, it's X1 salary, not X1 test. Does that make sense? Any questions? So let's go ahead and run that. We'll end there. And you notice now our regression line spans the entire set of values, which are independent values, namely the salary. Does that make sense? Any questions? So the only other thing I haven't done, oh my, I am way over. I apologize for that. The only thing we haven't done, I'll finish in 30 seconds, is that selecting the quartiles. And so part of the assignment is to select within one of your groupings what is the third quartile. And so when you call quintile on your data frame columns, it'll tell you what value represents that last quartile. So you're going to say the 75th quintile. And now you do filtering, and that filtering is going to say, give me all of the rows from my data from that group 1 or group 2 that have an annual salary that's above that 75th quintile, as well as years in residence that's above that 75th quintile. And when you do that, essentially what you're doing, we don't have chalk, is you're taking your group. So imagine if you have group 1 and you have another group. Let's say that's your group 1, group 2, and this is group 1. That's your cluster. You're basically chopping your 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You're chopping up into a 4x4 tessellation all of the points, and you're selecting the upper quartile here, and you're selecting the upper quartile along that side. Now here it doesn't overlap, but hopefully it should overlap in your data. Does that make sense? So you can do that double filtering based on both salary and years in residence. So I'll end there. I apologize. Ooh, I've never gone over this much. I will apologize for going over. I'll see you all on when? Today's Monday, on Wednesday. Okay.